What if the giants of Genesis never truly vanished, and their blood still runs through certain bloodlines today? Scripture never says the Nephilim were fully destroyed. It says something else survived the flood, and the Bible may have hidden the proof in plain sight. Genesis chapter 6 opens with a sentence that most readers pass over without a second thought. There were giants in the earth in those days. 4 words that carry the weight of an entire hidden history. And what follows that verse is even stranger, because Scripture does not say the giants appeared once and disappeared forever. It says something far more unsettling. It says they were there and also after that, meaning after the flood, meaning after the judgment that was supposed to erase them from the earth completely. That single phrase has troubled careful readers of the Bible for centuries. If the flood was sent to cleanse the earth of the corruption caused by the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, why does the giant bloodline show up again, generations later, in the land of Canaan? Numbers chapter 13 tells us plainly that when the 12 spies entered the promised land, they saw the descendants of Anakim, and they said, "We were in our own sight as grasshoppers." That is not poetic exaggeration. That is a description of encountering something the human mind struggles to categorize. The text names them: the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. Each nation carries its own record in Deuteronomy chapter 2, described as a people great and many and tall. These are not myths inserted by later scribes for dramatic effect. These are genealogical notes, treated by the biblical authors with the same seriousness as any other tribal record. And that raises a question most sermons never touch. If these bloodlines survived the flood, and if Joshua's conquest of Canaan was partly a campaign against the last strongholds of that lineage, what happened to the ones who were never fully wiped out? Because Scripture never claims total eradication. 1 Samuel tells us of Goliath of Gath, a descendant of the Rephaim, standing before the armies of Israel centuries after Joshua's campaigns were supposedly finished. 2 Samuel chapter 21 goes further, listing 4 separate giants born to the giant in Gath, each one killed individually, each one requiring a specific warrior to bring them down. That is not the language of a threat long extinguished. That is the language of a bloodline still active, still producing offspring, long after most people assume the Nephilim story had ended. Deuteronomy chapter 3 adds a detail that many readers skip past entirely. It describes Og, king of Bashan, as the remnant of the giants, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentions his bed of iron, measuring roughly 13.5 feet long. Scholars have debated for generations whether this was a literal bed or a ceremonial structure, but either reading points to the same conclusion. Og was remembered specifically because his size was extraordinary, even by the standards of a culture that already knew what giants looked like. And he is called the remnant, a word that implies survivors, plural, of which he was simply the last one standing in that particular region. A remnant does not describe a single anomaly. It describes what is left over after something larger has already existed and mostly but not entirely been removed. This is where the Book of Enoch, though not part of the standard biblical canon, becomes valuable as historical and theological context because it was clearly known and referenced by the authors of Scripture itself. Jude, in the New Testament, directly quotes Enoch's prophecy. Peter references the angels that sinned being cast into chains of darkness. These are not obscure footnotes. These are canonical writers treating the Watcher's narrative as real history, not folklore. Enoch describes fallen angels who went in unto the daughters of men, producing offspring described as devouring, violent, and impossible to satisfy. When their physical bodies died, Enoch says their spirits did not simply vanish. They remained on the earth as a separate class of being altogether. That detail matters more than most viewers realize, because it opens a door Genesis leaves only partially closed. If the spirit of a Nephilim does not die the way a human spirit dies, and if certain bloodlines carried physical traits that persisted for generations after the flood, then the question stops being about ancient history and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a question about inheritance, about what exactly was passed down and to whom. Some of the earliest Jewish and Christian commentators wrestled with exactly this problem. Targum's Pseudo-Jonathan an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah, describes the sons of God explicitly as angelic beings called Shamhazai and Azael, giving names to figures that Genesis leaves anonymous. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, described these offspring as beings of monstrous strength who did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians called giants. Even outside the biblical tradition, Mesopotamian texts preserve strikingly similar accounts of divine beings mingling with humanity and producing a race that outlived the flood myths of their own cultures. When separate ancient civilizations, writing independently, describe the same pattern, it becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. If you find this line of study meaningful, our illustrated guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, was created for exactly this kind of exploration. It walks through the full account of the Watchers, the birth of the giants, and what became of their bloodline after the flood, all illustrated so the images from Enoch's own visions come to life on the page rather than staying trapped in dense, ancient language. Many people who study this topic tell us that reading Enoch directly, with the illustrations guiding each vision, changed the way they understood not just Genesis 6, but the entire framework of hidden history running underneath Scripture. The link to claim your copy is waiting in the very first comment pinned beneath this video, so you don't have to go searching for it. What we are going to trace together in this video is not speculation for the sake of shock value. It is a careful walk through the biblical text itself, following the bloodline from before the flood, through Canaan, through the conquest, and into places Scripture leaves surprisingly open-ended. Because once you start asking where the descendants of the Nephilim actually went, rather than assuming they simply stopped existing, the biblical record starts answering in ways that are far harder to ignore than most people expect. Before we go further, if this kind of study speaks to something in you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This is where we walk through the parts of Scripture that rarely get preached from a pulpit, and where the hidden history behind the biblical text gets the attention it deserves. The land of Canaan, when Israel finally approached its borders, was not empty ground waiting to be claimed. It was occupied territory, and much of that occupation carried the same bloodline the flood was supposed to have ended. Genesis chapter 15, long before the conquest even began, lists the nations Abraham's descendants would eventually face, and buried in that list are names most casual readers skip past: the Rephaim, alongside the more familiar Canaanites and Amorites. God tells Abraham directly that his descendants will inherit land currently held by these people. That is a striking detail, because it means the giant bloodline was already recognized, already named, generations before Joshua ever crossed the Jordan. By the time the 12 spies were sent into the land in Numbers chapter 13, the fear they brought back was specific and detailed. They didn't simply say the land was defended. They said, "The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof." And then, almost as an explanation for their panic, they described the sons of Anak, calling them Nephilim by name. 10 of the 12 spies came back convinced the mission was hopeless, not because of numbers, but because of what they had actually seen standing in front of them. Only Caleb and Joshua, out of the entire company, believed the conquest was still possible, and Caleb's confidence becomes even more remarkable later, when Joshua chapter 14 records him personally requesting the mountain country where the Anakim still lived, at 85 years old, specifically because he wanted to be the one to drive them out. That request tells you something the text never states outright. If Caleb needed to ask for that territory by name, decades after the initial spy mission, it means the Anakim was still there, still occupying that specific region, largely untouched by the intervening campaigns. The bloodline was not eliminated in one decisive battle. It persisted in isolated strongholds, generation after generation, surviving in the hill country long after the plains had been subdued. Joshua chapter 11 gives us the closest thing Scripture offers to a final accounting of the Anakim, stating that Joshua cut off the Anakims from the mountains, listing Hebron, Debir, and Anab by name, and then adding a detail that should stop any careful reader in their tracks. It says none of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained 3 cities, 3 Philistine strongholds, specifically named as places where the bloodline was not destroyed, but rather permitted to continue. That is not the language of total victory. That is the language of a targeted, incomplete campaign that pushed the giant lineage out of Israelite territory and directly into the heart of Philistine civilization, a civilization that would remain Israel's primary military adversary for centuries afterward. This single verse reframes everything that follows in the biblical narrative. When Goliath steps onto the battlefield in 1 Samuel chapter 17, identified specifically as being of Gath, he is not an isolated monster appearing from nowhere. He is the direct, textually traceable descendant of the very bloodline Joshua's armies deliberately allowed to survive in that exact city centuries earlier. The text even gives his height 6 cubits and a span, somewhere between 9 and 11 feet depending on which cubit measurement scholars use, and describes his armor in such specific, itemized detail, the weight of his spearhead, the weight of his coat of mail, that the author clearly intends the reader to understand this as something categorically different from an ordinary soldier. And Goliath was not alone. 2 Samuel chapter 21 preserves a record easily missed by anyone reading quickly because it lists 4 separate giants, each requiring a separate warrior to defeat him, each one explicitly identified as born to the giant in Gath, Ishbibenob, carrying a spear weighing 300 shekels of brass. Saph, another unnamed son of the giant, killed by Jonathan, David's nephew, described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in total, a detail the text records without embellishment or explanation, simply stating it as biological fact. 4 giants, 1 bloodline, 1 city, appearing generations after Joshua's supposedly completed conquest. What this reveals is not a single monster problem solved by a single shepherd boy with a sling. It reveals a persistent genetic thread, geographically concentrated, textually documented across multiple books and multiple centuries, surfacing again and again whenever Israel came into direct conflict with the Philistines. The Bible does not treat these encounters as isolated horror stories. It treats them as ongoing military reality, the kind of threat significant enough to require named champions, detailed armor descriptions, and specific tactical responses every single time the bloodline resurfaced. The deeper question this raises is not whether giants existed. Scripture settles that question repeatedly, across too many independent books and authors to dismiss as a shared literary device. The deeper question is what happened to that bloodline after Gath eventually fell, after the Philistine cities were absorbed, scattered, and assimilated into the wider populations surrounding Israel. Genetic lines do not simply vanish when a city is conquered. They disperse. They intermarry. They move. Consider what actually happened to Gath itself. The Chronicles record Uzziah, king of Judah, breaking down the walls of Gath centuries after David's reign, which tells us the city had already changed hands multiple times, absorbed and reabsorbed by different powers, its population never simply erased, but continually folded into whichever empire controlled the region at that moment. Assyrian records from the same general period describe the deportation and resettlement of populations across the entire Levant, a practice that scattered entire bloodlines across territories stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia. A family carrying Rephaim ancestry in Gath during David's reign would not have vanished when the city eventually fell. Their descendants would have been absorbed into the surrounding nations, intermarrying, relocating, their physical traits diluted across generations, but never fully erased from the historical or genealogical record. This is precisely why the biblical authors kept returning to this bloodline for centuries after Joshua's initial campaign. Long after most other nations mentioned in the conquest, narratives had faded quietly into the background of the text. They were not repeating an old story out of habit. They were tracking a lineage that kept resurfacing, in new cities under new names, whenever the text needed to explain why certain enemies of Israel seemed to carry traits no ordinary human population displayed. And Scripture, if you read closely enough, may be quietly tracking exactly where that bloodline went next. To understand where the bloodline actually went, you have to step outside Canaan entirely and look at what happened east of the Jordan, in the region the Bible calls Bashan and Ammon. Deuteronomy chapter 2, in the same breath that describes the Amim as a people great and many and tall as the Anakims, also tells us the Ammonites called them Zamzumims, and that the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they succeeded them and dwelt in their stead. Notice the wording carefully. It does not say the Ammonites exterminated every last member of that population. It says they succeeded them, meaning they inherited the territory and, almost certainly, absorbed whatever remained of the people who had lived there before them. The same pattern repeated with the Horims in Seir, driven out by the descendants of Esau, who then dwelt in their place. This pattern of succession rather than annihilation appears so consistently across Deuteronomy chapter 2 that it starts to look less like an accident of translation and more like a deliberate historical record. Nation after nation is described taking over the land of a taller, older people, without a single verse claiming complete destruction of that population. The Moabites did the same thing to a people called the Amim, described in the very same chapter as tall and numerous as the Anakims. And when Israel finally engaged Sihon, king of the Amorites, in battle east of the Jordan, they were fighting a kingdom built directly on top of territory the Emim and Rephaim had occupied generations earlier, a kingdom whose own royal lineage may well have carried traces of that older bloodline through generations of regional intermarriage between conquering and conquered peoples. Bloodlines under conquest rarely disappear. They get absorbed into the conquering culture, their traits diluted through intermarriage, but never fully erased from the genetic record passed down through following generations. This is where the extra-biblical material becomes genuinely useful for understanding what the biblical authors assumed their readers already knew, context that shaped, quite deeply and permanently, how ancient audiences would have received these later accounts of giants without any need for further explanation. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text that expands significantly on Genesis, describes the Rephaim and related giant nations in far more geographic detail than the canonical text provides alone, tracing their movement across the entire Transjordan region, from Bashan down through Ammon and Moab, well before Israel ever arrived. The Genesis Apocryphon, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserves an expanded account of the years immediately following the flood, describing Noah's own household grappling directly with the presence of spirits and giant offspring still active in the world his family had just inherited, a detail that suggests even the flood survivors understood their victory over that corruption had been partial rather than absolute. These are not contradictions of Scripture. They are the surrounding context ancient readers would have understood instinctively, context that modern readers, centuries removed from that world, have largely lost. And then there is the War Scroll, another Dead Sea Scroll, which describes an end-times battle against forces explicitly connected to the Watchers and their offspring, framing the conflict not as a purely political or military struggle, but as the continuation of a spiritual war that began in Genesis chapter 6 and never fully concluded. The Aramaic Book of Giants goes even further, giving us names Ohia and Haya among them, sons of the Watcher Shemihaza, describing their dreams, their fear of coming judgment, and their awareness that their existence itself violated the natural order established at creation, an awareness that, according to the fragments preserved in these scrolls, haunted them long before any floodwaters ever arrived. These texts were not written by isolated fringe communities detached from mainstream Jewish thought. They were preserved, copied, and studied by the same communities responsible for transmitting the Hebrew scriptures themselves, found together in the same caves, treated with comparable reverence, wrapped and stored alongside fragments of Isaiah, Deuteronomy, and the Psalms, as though their message belonged to the same larger conversation about the nature of evil and its origins. What all of this material converges on is a picture far more complex than giants existed, then a flood happened, then giants stopped existing. It describes an ongoing spiritual and physical reality, one where the offspring of the Watchers, even after physical death, continued to exist as a distinct category of being, unlike anything else recorded in the ancient world, and where their bloodlines, wherever they survived physically, carried something the biblical authors treated as fundamentally different from ordinary human ancestry. Enoch describes the spirits of the dead giants becoming what he calls evil spirits upon the earth, entities that would afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth. long after their physical bodies had perished. If that description is taken seriously within its own context, it suggests the danger this bloodline represented was never purely genetic to begin with. It was something layered, both physical and spiritual, inherited through blood, but also, somehow, through the spirit realm the Watchers themselves had originated from. This dual nature may explain something that puzzles careful readers of the later biblical narrative. Why does the giant bloodline keep appearing specifically in moments of heightened spiritual conflict, rather than surfacing randomly throughout the historical record, the way an ordinary ethnic minority might? Goliath does not simply threaten Israel militarily. He mocks the armies of the living God directly, framing the confrontation in explicitly religious terms before a single stone is thrown. The battle in 1 Samuel reads less like a conventional military skirmish and more like a spiritual confrontation given physical form, exactly the kind of battle the war scroll describes as the ultimate destiny of this ancient conflict, one that began before the flood, and according to some of these texts would not be fully resolved until the end of the age itself. If the bloodline survived through the Ammonites, through the scattered remnants in Bashan, through the Philistine cities, through generations of intermarriage stretching across the entire ancient Near East, then Scripture's own internal logic suggests something unsettling. The final resolution of that ancient conflict was never fully completed within the biblical narrative itself. It was left open, unresolved, a thread the text picks up again and again without ever fully tying off, right up through the prophetic literature and into apocalyptic visions written centuries later. Visions that describe a final confrontation between the forces of heaven and a corruption rooted, quite literally, in the earth itself. There is a valley just southwest of Jerusalem that carries the name of this bloodline directly in its title. The Valley of Rephaim, mentioned repeatedly in 2 Samuel and Chronicles, sits close enough to the city of David that David himself fought 2 separate battles there against the Philistines. Battles the text records with unusual specificity, as though the location itself carried weight the original audience would have immediately understood. You do not name a valley after a people unless that people's presence in the land was significant enough and recent enough to still shape how the surrounding population identified the geography around them. This was not ancient history to David's contemporaries. This was the landscape they walked through, named after a bloodline whose descendants had, within living memory, still been fighting in these same hills. What makes the Valley of Rephaim particularly revealing is what it tells us about proximity. This was not some distant frontier region far from Israel's political center. It was practically in Jerusalem's backyard, close enough that David could march out, fight a battle, and return to his own capital within the same campaign season. If the descendants of this bloodline were still active this close to the heart of Israelite territory during David's reign, centuries after Joshua's conquest, it becomes far harder to imagine the bloodline simply dissolving into nothing shortly afterward. Populations that persist that close to a hostile power's capital city do not typically vanish quietly. They get absorbed gradually, generation by generation, into the surrounding population through trade, through captivity, through the ordinary mechanics of intermarriage that accompany centuries of shared geography. And this absorption did not stop when the kingdom of Israel itself began to fracture and fall. When Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, and later when Babylon conquered Judah, entire populations were displaced across the ancient world, scattered into territories stretching from Egypt to Persia. Any bloodline still carrying traces of Rephaim or Anakim ancestry, already diluted through centuries of intermarriage among the Philistines, the Ammonites, and the broader Canaanite population, would have been swept into that same displacement, scattered even further across the ancient Near East. This is precisely the kind of historical mechanism that explains why traces of unusually large stature, unusual physical traits, and local legends of giant ancestors appear scattered across so many different cultures surrounding the biblical world, rather than remaining confined neatly to the borders of ancient Canaan. This pattern becomes even more striking when you widen the lens beyond the biblical text entirely and look at what the ancient world left behind in stone. Göbekli Tepe, in modern Turkey, predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. its massive carved pillars raised by a civilization archaeologists still cannot fully explain, built with a level of coordinated labor that seems almost impossible for the era it comes from. Baalbek in Lebanon contains foundation stones weighing well over 1,000 tons each, cut and positioned with a precision that modern engineers still study with genuine bewilderment. Puma Punku, high in the Bolivian mountains, and Sacsayhuaman in Peru, both display stonework fitted so tightly that even a blade of grass cannot slide between the joints, all without any evidence of the wheel, the pulley system, or the metal tools that conventional history assumes would have been necessary. None of this proves on its own a direct genetic link to the Nephilim described in Genesis, but it does establish something the biblical text itself hints at repeatedly. Ancient civilizations across the entire globe preserved consistent, independent traditions of a race of great beings who once lived among ordinary humans, taught forbidden knowledge, and built structures beyond what their descendants could later replicate. Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humanity the working of metals, the making of weapons, the arts of astrology and enchantment, knowledge that Genesis chapter 6 associates directly with the corruption that led to divine judgment. If the offspring of these beings carried not just physical size, but inherited knowledge and capability, passed down through their bloodline, scattered across the earth after the flood, and again after the Babylonian and Assyrian deportations, it would help explain why so many unrelated ancient cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, all preserved remarkably similar memories of giants who built impossible things. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents ever recovered, describes pre-flood kings ruling for periods of time so extended that scholars have debated their meaning for over a century, some proposing the numbers reflect an entirely different, more capable form of human existence before the flood reshaped the world. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's own creation epic, describes conflict between divine beings and their offspring in terms strikingly similar to the Watcher's narrative, even though it comes from a culture with no direct connection to the authors of Genesis. Ugaritic texts, recovered from ancient Canaanite religious archives, reference the Rephaim not merely as a historical people, but as a category of semi-divine beings associated with the realm of the dead, treated with a reverence that suggests their memory carried spiritual weight long after their physical presence in the land had ended. Taken together, this body of evidence suggests something the biblical authors may have understood far better than modern readers typically give them credit for. The bloodline was never confined to a single valley, a single Philistine city, or a single generation of conquest. It was woven, gradually and quietly, into the wider fabric of the ancient world, surfacing in different cultures under different names, remembered differently by different peoples, but tracing back, according to the internal logic of Genesis itself, to the same original union between the Watchers and the daughters of men that started this entire story. Josephus, writing centuries after the biblical events themselves, noted that the memory of these beings persisted well beyond Israel's own borders, observed among many nations across the known world who preserved their own versions of the same account, each culture reshaping the details while keeping the essential structure of the story intact. That kind of cross-cultural consistency rarely happens by accident. Myths that spread purely through storytelling tend to fragment and diverge wildly over centuries of separation, losing their core details with every retelling passed between unrelated peoples. A memory this stable, surfacing consistently in Mesopotamia, in the Andes in Anatolia, and in the hill country of Judah, points instead towards something that actually happened, something genuinely real enough to leave physical evidence and genealogical residue scattered across an entire ancient world that had no reliable, consistent way of communicating with itself over such vast distances. Jesus himself, according to Matthew chapter 24, pointed his disciples directly back to this exact period of history when they asked him about the sign of his coming and the end of the age. His answer was not a vague generality about wickedness increasing. He named a specific era. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. He described people eating, drinking, marrying, going about ordinary life, completely unaware of the judgment approaching until the flood came and took them all away. Most readers hear this passage and focus only on the surprise element, the suddenness of judgment, catching people unprepared. But Jesus chose those specific days deliberately. Out of the entire span of human history available to him, the exact period Genesis chapter 6 identifies as the era corrupted by the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, the era that produced the Nephilim in the first place. That is not a coincidence a careful reader can simply pass over. If Jesus is describing the end of the age as a direct parallel to the days of Noah, and Genesis explicitly identifies the corruption of that era as originating from the Watchers and their offspring, then the parallel is not just about moral decline in general terms. It suggests something more specific, something the New Testament authors clearly believed their audience already understood, well enough not to require further explanation. Jude, writing to the early church, makes this connection explicit rather than implicit. He describes the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. He places this warning directly alongside his condemnation of false teachers infiltrating the church, treating the Watchers' rebellion as a real historical event carrying ongoing spiritual consequences, not a mythological illustration borrowed for rhetorical effect. 2 Peter chapter 2 repeats nearly the same language, describing God not sparing the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Two separate New Testament authors, writing independently, both reach back to this same account, both treating it as foundational enough to anchor warnings about the church's own future. And then there is Revelation, the final book of the New Testament canon, which describes a war in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, being cast down to the earth along with a third of the stars of heaven, an image many careful readers connect directly back to the language used throughout Enoch and the broader Watcher tradition to describe the original angelic rebellion. Revelation chapter 9 goes even further, describing beings released from the bottomless pit during the end times, locusts with the faces of men, the hair of women, and the teeth of lions, a description strange enough that most modern readers assume it must be purely symbolic. But symbolic imagery in apocalyptic literature typically draws on categories the original audience would already recognize, and an audience steeped in the Enoch tradition, familiar with the Watchers and their monstrous offspring, would have understood exactly what kind of ancient horror this imagery was meant to evoke, resurfacing at the end of the age. This creates a striking symmetry across the entire span of Scripture. Genesis chapter 6 opens human history with the corruption of angelic beings intermarrying with humanity, producing a bloodline of violent, physically extraordinary offspring. Revelation closes human history with imagery deliberately echoing that same corruption, released again during the final years before Christ's return. If the biblical authors intended these bookends to mirror each other this closely, it raises a question most churches never address directly from the pulpit. What if the bloodline was never meant to be permanently eliminated within the timeline of ordinary history at all? What if Scripture itself anticipates its return or its full unveiling, specifically at the end of the age, meaning any bloodline surviving quietly through the intervening centuries would represent not a loose thread the biblical authors simply forgot to resolve, but a deliberate, unfinished narrative awaiting its final chapter. Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 tells believers directly that their struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That language echoes the same spiritual architecture described throughout the Watcher tradition, a hierarchy of fallen beings still actively influencing the physical world centuries after their initial rebellion. Daniel chapter 10 offers one of the clearest windows into how this spiritual hierarchy was believed to operate behind the visible events of history. When an angel finally appears to Daniel after 3 weeks of unanswered prayer, he explains the delay by describing a direct conflict with the prince of the kingdom of Persia, a spiritual power resisting him until Michael intervened. This is not language describing ordinary human politics. It describes territorial spiritual beings, embedded within the affairs of specific nations, exercising influence that shapes the course of empires from behind the scenes. If such beings existed and operated this way in Daniel's time, the logic of Scripture leaves open the possibility that similar influence tied to bloodlines the Watchers themselves fathered continued shaping nations and events long after the biblical narrative concludes. If the bloodline of the Nephilim carried both a physical and spiritual component, exactly as Enoch describes, then its survival would not need to look like an obvious population of giants walking openly among us. It could look like something far quieter, far more difficult to trace, hidden within ordinary bloodlines scattered across the earth through thousands of years of migration, conquest, and intermarriage, surfacing only in traits, tendencies, and spiritual influences. The biblical authors seem to expect the discerning reader would eventually learn to recognize. This is precisely why Scripture repeatedly frames the end times not as a sudden invention of new evil, but as the re-emergence of something ancient, something already present in the world's foundations, waiting for the right conditions to surface again in full view. Revelation's imagery, Daniel's visions, Jesus' own warning about the days of Noah, all point toward the same unsettling conclusion. The corruption introduced in Genesis chapter 6 was never fully resolved by the flood. It was contained, scattered, and driven underground, but Scripture consistently describes it resurfacing at moments of maximum spiritual significance, and the final resurfacing, according to the prophetic pattern these authors establish, has not happened yet. The bloodline was never fully erased. Scripture traces it too consistently across too many books for that to be an accident. Thank you for walking through this with us today. If Genesis 6 left you with more questions than answers, our illustrated guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, unpacks the Watchers, the giants, and everything Scripture only hints at, with visuals that bring Enoch's own visions to life. The link is pinned in the first comment below. Subscribe if this kind of study speaks to you. Like this video, tell us in the comments which bloodline detail surprised you most, and stay close, because the next video picks up exactly where this ancient thread leads next.